Hi, I'm Matt Romoser with the Iowa Pork Industry Center, and today I want to talk to you about gilt nutrition and some basic fundamentals that we think about when thinking about gilt development. Now, prior to even talking about what we're going to feed these gilts from a ration basis, I want to start off and start thinking about how we can intervene in those gilts from an early standpoint, from a nutrition standpoint, and what impact can we have in that pre-weaning environment to get them off to the best start. It's often important that we think about that gilt development starts as early as day one, or as early as, as we as caretakers can intervene would be that day one pig care. Work has shown where adequate colostrum intake is vital for optimal growth and health and can improve the reproductive ability of gilts, as there's been a positive relationship shown between colostrum intake and uterine development, as well as the pre-weaning growth and weaning weight shown has shown a positive relationship with P2 retention and total productivity to P4. Also, there's been work that's shown that pigs fostered to multiparous sows are heavier at 42 days of age. So I think it's interesting to think about this from a strategy that multiplication herds could possibly implement, where you maybe cross-foster gilts to older sows and maybe maternal barrows to gilts within a multiplication herd in order to really maximize that pre-weaning growth for those gilts in that pre-weaning environment. Obviously, from there, we talk about the growing phase, or basically from weaning out to breeding, and what we need to do from a nutrition standpoint to set up those gilts to be the most successful and the most productive over the course of their lifetime. So we think about managing growth rate and how it's necessary during that gilt development phase to minimize skeletal stress, but still optimize reproductive potential and lactation potential as we develop those gilts. So first, I want to introduce just a few targets we want to be able to attain. Obviously, a target for optimal lifetime, target weight for optimal lifetime performance. We want to look at roughly 250 to a little bit over 300 pounds at puberty or when they reach that first estrus. And then again, as we've stated in previous slide sets, roughly around that 300 to 350 pounds at first mating. So really much over that, we start to have gilts that are a little bit too heavy at that first mating, and it limits their ability to reach those later maturity or those later parities. But much younger or much lighter than that, and we really don't have the necessary energy reserves to make it through a lactation properly. So when we think about those optimal weights, we also need to think about growth rate and how we manage those gilts through that time period. And shown here, the general recommendations that we use in the industry be about roughly 1.3 to 1.7 or 1.8 pounds per day, and that's lifetime average daily gain. Over the course of about 210 to 220 days, will get you to that optimal weight where we're talking about 300 and 350 pounds at that first mating. Obviously, as we just stated, we want to be able to manage that growth to minimize skeletal stress. We want to be able to think about how much feed and how much energy these gilts need to be taken in. So ad libitum feeding can result in excessive growth rate. Obviously, with today's current genetic lines, we select for growth rate and high feed intake. So gilts that grow have an excessive growth rate can have an increased potential for lameness or an increased risk of osteochondrosis. So how we manage that gilt and how we restrict feed intake could be potentially a strategy that we need to be able to look at in order to make sure that we're keeping her in optimal condition. Restricting feed intake too much, however, can limit mammary development, certainly if the minimum nutrient intake is insufficient or not met during that developmental period. Some work has shown where reducing that lysine to energy ratio or restricting energy by 20 to 25% can help to decrease that growth rate and help reduce lameness. Both the studies shown here showed that ultimately it did show a reduced or a delay in puberty achievement. So we do need to weigh that from a gilt development and reproductive management standpoint. I believe the study shown here also didn't show a lifetime impact on fertility. But still, from a selection standpoint and being able to identify those gilts that reach puberty earlier, we do need to be able to consider how much and how drastic do we really want to be with restricting energy during that growing period. Some additional requirements we want to think about during development is obviously additional calcium and phosphorus. So additional calcium and phosphorus is going to be beneficial for helping maximize bone mineralization. And in general, to maximize that bone mineralization, it's going to be roughly 8% greater than what we're going to use the minimum requirement for maximum growth. So we're going to increase that by about roughly 8% in the diet in order to really maximize that bone density and bone mineralization for those replacement gilts. As well as we should consider supplementing vitamins and trace minerals that could also be added to the diet. Usually, vitamins such as choline, pyroxidine, folic acid, and biotin, ones that are beneficial for reproduction, are often absent in finishing premixes and late finishing. So, keeping those in a gilt ration and towards the latter part of finishing or towards heavier weights could be beneficial when we want to think about selection and keeping her for reproduction, as well as introducing some trace minerals have been shown to also help reduce incidence of osteochondrosis there. We'll talk strategy of flush feeding, and one that's been around and been thought of in the industry for a long time. Flush feeding is simply the practice of increasing feed allowance or the energy, higher energy intake prior to that first insemination. So typically you may put those gilts on ad libitum feed or increase the amount of calories that gilt may take in 1 to 2 weeks prior to that first insemination. And ultimately, when these early studies were done, it found that increasing that energy intake improved the GnRH release and then subsequent ovulation. So the thought always was by increasing energy increase, we can increase litter size, at least through that first litter. Ultimately, with modern genetics and us having a better understanding of what's that optimal ideal body weight that we want to be able to breed these gilts at, the benefit of additional feed intake pre-breeding is really lost so long as those gilts are really at that optimal body weight when we breed them for the first time. There may be some benefits still if a gilt is below those breeding weight thresholds to be able to flush feed, and really we're just trying to put on the added weight to get her into that ideal body weight range prior to that first breeding. So now we've ultimately gotten that gilt through the developmental phase. We've bred her. She's into the herd. Now we need to talk about how we're going to manage that gilt during gestation from a nutritional standpoint. So we talk about during the first 30 days of gestation. Obviously, lots of important milestones are occurring with regards to pregnancy establishment. So being able to target those maintenance feeding levels is going to be important. So obviously, trying to meet those maintenance requirements for obviously maintenance. Growth, obviously these gilts are still going to have some requirement for growth as they're not fully to their mature size, as well as obviously meeting the reproduction requirements nutritionally. So increased feed allotment, obviously putting gilts on ad lib feed or feeding them excess energy has been shown to impair litter size and ultimately increase back fat in the female, which long-term compromises her productivity, added weight gain, increased mature size, and ultimately increases her cost of production in the herd. We talk about mid-gestation. Again, we want to be able to feed to that ideal body condition score. So this is obviously vital for optimizing longevity, not getting a gilt too heavy too early in her life, and ultimately gilts that enter into lactation that are a little bit overweight are going to have reduced lactation performance, and then it's going to also help you manage your feed costs better if you keep that gilt in a more ideal body condition score during that gestation period. We talk about management of late gestation. Typically, there's a practice what we call bump feeding, which is basically just increasing that feed allotment towards the latter part of gestation, which the thought traditionally was to be able to add a little bit extra birth weight to that litter or to the individual pigs within the litter. Work and studies have shown that in best case, you can only moderately increase birth weight of those pigs, but ultimately you're increasing the amount of feed you're having to give that sow, compromising her body condition, as well as compromising stillborn rate in the process. So really, it's a net negative long term when we're thinking about the viability of the litter as well as the performance of that sow with regards to lactational feed intake and milk production as well. So some just general summary recommendations. Obviously, the area of nutrition is very broad and still learning more from a gilt development standpoint, but just wanted to leave you with a few just general summary recommendations as we think about what we need to do from a nutritional standpoint when it comes to managing gilts. Again, as we started out talking about the pre-weaning period, implementing strategies that we can maximize that colostrum intake for those gilts, whether it be implementing a split suckling protocol, as we talked earlier, cross-fostering gilts to older parity sows that maybe have increased lactation performance or increased colostrum production. During the growing phase, again, targeting a set growth rate, a lifetime growth rate of about 1.3 to 1.7 or 1.8 pounds per day. Ultimately trying to target the weight parameters shown here with weight at first estrus being around that 250 to 300 pounds. and weight at first mating from 300 to 350 pounds. Ultimately, it's going to set you up with a gilt that's robust enough to be able to have the energy reserve to get through a lactation, but not so heavy to where it becomes compromising with her longevity long term. Providing additional calcium and phosphorus to be able to maximize bone mineralization, and then considering additional vitamins and trace minerals that may be absent in late finishing diets. Talk about during that breeding period. Flush feeding is really only necessary if we're talking about trying to get gilts that are below that target weight for first breeding. And then again, managing gestation really comes down to managing that gilt's body condition, making sure that we're keeping her in an ideal body condition, in an ideal shape before she goes into lactation for the first time, ultimately to help maximize that milk production and colostrum production, and ultimately be a more cost-effective animal because we don't have excess feed and excess resources put into her to get her through that first lactation. I want to thank you for watching. For more information, feel free to visit our website. And with Iowa State University, I'm Matt Romoser.